So afternoon, I'm the last session. I realised during the course of the day that I've probably got the most boring job title of the presenters here today. But hopefully you'll see that I work for an organisation that's quite interesting, and also as part of our transformation journey I do actually have a team of UXers working for me now, and I'd like to talk through that journey and how we've got to where we are today. But first of all, who are we? Has anyone heard of Innovate UK? Other than Nemensa, of course. Right. So for those of you that haven't heard of us, we're what we call the UK's innovation agency, and we give grant funding to businesses to try and help stimulate and drive innovation for the good of the UK economy. There's lots of investors out there, but they're typically only interested in those dead certs, the ones that are very, very close to commercialisation. And we recognise that really innovation is risky and you need to get involved very early on. And very often, particularly with SMEs, that funding's just not available. So we try and get involved there, typically by running competitions. And how I joined Innovate UK, although when it was back in 2011 when I started, it was called the Technology Strategy Board. I joined there as a competitions manager, and my job was to run those competitions on behalf of the organisation and give out that grant funding. Quite a convoluted process, as we'll get into. Achievements, this is quite an old slide now, but the sorts of things that we've been able to achieve. The key thing is £7.30 for every £1 we've invested in projects, so quite a good return. Invested in lots of organisations, working together with academia. Typically our competitions try and encourage collaboration through trying to get businesses to collaborate with academics so we can transfer that knowledge and research and get it commercialised and bring those really good ideas to market. Back in April, we merged together with the research councils in the UK, so 9 organisations joining together to become what is now called UK Research and Innovation. So research councils like Medical Research Council, MRC, BBSRC and so on. I'm not going to go into details on those, but they provide funding typically on the academic side. We uniquely provide funding to businesses. And the whole structuring of those together is to try and stimulate the cross-cutting or taking the research and getting that mapped more quickly and bring those ideas to market. As part of UK, one of the key interests in UK research and innovation, or one of the things that's keeping us really busy at the moment, is the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. You might have heard about industrial strategy. The government talks about it. It's a lot of news in the press. I'll just go on to the, so this is all the marketing around it. So it's typically challenge-led. The challenges are down the right-hand side. They are changing. Every time there's a public sector review, they bring out new ones. So AI and data economy, future of mobility, clean growth, ageing society. So it's really about trying to solve those societal challenges by the UK investing in those, but also trying to stimulate investment from the private sector as well. So a really good example is something that's been in the press very recently, which is the Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Centre. So UKRI have invested 13 million in that, but it's a £56 million collaboration with Strathclyde University and GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca. The idea is to build for that collaboration to work together to bring medicines and that technology to market far more quickly and become a centre of excellence. It's done outside of the UK, but they want to make the UK a really world leader in that particular area. So that's a good example of a societal challenge. So that's just the background to who we are and what we're doing at the moment. I'm going to go back to Innovate UK and the problem that we had relating to trying to automate our processes. So back in 2014, we were given the directive by our parents, who were at that time the Department of Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, and they wanted us to move onto the gov.uk platform. Might appear quite simple solution, so it was to move our branded website with our purple over onto the black and white gov.uk. But whilst it was just a move of the website at that time, it there was all the content change. So gov.uk have got some very tight standards. Anyone familiar with GDS? Gov.uk standards? I know it's used a lot in UX design, but in actual fact, working through those standards is quite a challenge in its own right, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that was back in 2014. At that time, we were a public sector body, like lots of other government departments. Our IT function was really just to support the laptops and the systems. We had a paper-based process. So when I joined in 2011, as I said, it was quite ironic. I was joining the Technology Strategy Board. I have a software background, so I've been used to working with systems and designing software for people, but I joined as a competitions manager, and they had a paper-based process. There was a freeze on IT. I could have as many temps as I wanted to process those paper-based applications, but no spend on IT whatsoever, other than what was there at all. So the result was lots of spreadsheets, lots of teams together working on spreadsheets, but as you can imagine, and the problems that come with that, they all had their own spreadsheet. It was all slightly different, didn't really work together. And it was a real process, quite a convoluted process to get the funding out the door. In those days, we were running about 60 competitions a year, but that was still quite a lot given the process was manual. Talk a little bit more about the process in a moment. So GDS, in order to move on our digital journey, in order to get the funding granted to be able to invest in going onto a digital platform, we had to meet this digital standard. GDS, that's a screenshot of the GDS as it is today. This is just a bit of history for those of you. It started off probably earlier than 2010, but that was the result of the Martha Lane Fox review. And then in 2012, there were the 25 exemplar projects of things like apply for your passport, tax disc, that sort of thing. And then moving on from that, they wanted to expand out the gov.uk platform into other services, and that's where we started getting involved as a government agency, and we wanted to put our funding service, or they wanted us to put that onto their gov.uk platform. At the same time, they were doing platform as a service, so they recognised that a lot of those services had very similar problems, or they were trying to solve very similar problems. So by developing platforms that those services could take on and use, it would remove a lot of the effort from some of the services. So things like Verify for verifying user ID, verifying individual users, payments, notifying people, and so on. Unfortunately, we were a little bit ahead of the game in Notify, so we didn't actually use that. And Verify, when we started, our services are all about funding businesses rather than individuals. In order to give the grant out, it has to go to a business or an organisation, not a particular individual. And their Verify platform was focused on looking at individuals. So we had to work with them on how we could make that work for verifying organisations. And then we come up to 2017, where it was more about, they were trying to talk to government bodies about, it's not just about moving your processes onto a digital platform, it's how you can transform them, how you can improve at the same time. We were already on the case there because the processes we had in-house were so convoluted, we knew that we needed to simplify them anyway, and that was a key theme of the GDS standard as it was, to keep it simple. So this was the old process. We'd got the front end, we got the screen onto the gov.uk platform, but behind that link was a paper-based document that you downloaded. This is an example of the application form that someone's completed. Horrible. Just to talk about the volumes. So for a typical competition, we might get 2,000 users registering on our websites. They would then download that Word document. We give them an individual user ID and password because it had to be secure, because they were writing about their IP and some commercially sensitive information in their applications. So we might get 500 applications from that particular competition. We would then close the competition, download all those applications, send them out for assessment. We use external assessors, so business people, academics, whom we had to pay to incentivise them to do those assessments. But those were the best people because their expertise, they have day jobs working out in the sector or working at universities. But if you think about 500 applications, we would send those applications to 5 assessors each so that we got an average across them. We didn't rely on one individual, so that we kept it fair and transparent. So that'd be 2,500 applications just for this one competition, and we'd be running several of those every month. From a very competitive process, and it's become more so since we had the European referendum. There seemed to be a demand in requests for funding. And also since the industrial strategy even more. But we might fund 20 of those. In actual fact, probably it's around 10 to 20% success rate on a particular competition. We would then notify them that they're successful or unsuccessful, give them their feedback, so let them know what the assessors have said about their project. And then we go through something that we call project setup, which is all about collecting additional information like bank details, additional information who we can verify the business, that there's no fraud going on, that type of thing. So quite a convoluted process there. Was all done via email and so on. And then we'd actually try and get those funded projects started so that they could start performing that innovation. So that's the process that we needed to put online. This is just to show you the sorts of queries that we used to get in while it was on paper, all around the application process. So even if a very lengthy guidance document, I think when I joined it was about 70 pages. We managed to standardise a lot of it and get it onto the website, but even then it was still 30 pages per competition. But people didn't read it; they just guessed. They don't read documentation, do they? And then also they'd upload their application into this secure website. But because there was no notification to tell them that it had done it successfully, they then get on the phone, call the help desk and ask, can you just check that my application's uploaded okay? And so then the support team would have to do that many times. So we needed a way of solving that and making it far easier for our users. So that's just a bit of background. So we then started our digital journey. I'm going to talk a bit about the collaboration here as well, because it's a Collaborate conference. The first thing we did, so we had a business change team in-house by then. We'd recognised that we needed to change and we're trying to work out what we needed to change. So we came up with this very simple process diagram. My boss used to call it the purple necklace. I've since changed the colour on the red ones because that's what we're working on now. We needed to deliver the purple ones at the time. So for someone applying into a competition all the way through to actually running the project, which is the red boxes, and then us being able to measure the impact on it so that we can report back. Because the government, if they're investing in things, they want to know what return that they're getting on it to make sure that we are investing in the right things. In order to get the funding, I mentioned earlier on, we needed to meet the GDS standards. So if they were going to let anything go on gov.uk, it needed to meet their standards. But we also, in order to get funding, we had to prove that we met the standards. So for those of you that aren't familiar with them, these are the 18 standards that you have to pass at various stages through your project. So our project was split up into, we did a discovery and alpha, and then we had to go for assessment to check that we were on the right track. We then got another bunch of funding, and then we went through the beta phase, and we had to get another assessment before we could actually go into what they call public beta on gov.uk. I'm not going to go through all of these. I've highlighted the ones in bold are the ones that we found took the most effort, as you can imagine, so understanding user needs, ongoing research, and so on. I'll probably refer back to them later on. But we had to meet the criteria for each one of those. There's far more detail behind it. It's all on the GDS website. There's a full service manual there if anyone's interested in them or not aware of them. So collaboration, we worked with a UX partner, should be nameless in this one, for our discovery and alpha, and I'll talk through that in a moment. But also we realised to our cost, actually, because we didn't pass our first alpha assessment, we needed to collaborate very heavily with our colleagues at GDS on gov.uk because they could point you in the right direction. It was as much about who you knew, as well as what you knew as well. So that's why I've included them as a collaboration partner. And actually as we got into the cycle and realising what we needed to do, bearing in mind this was all new to us, we weren't familiar with this type of thing, then it worked to our favour by collaborating and involving them in our sprints and show and tells and so on. And then once we got into beta, we obviously got into collaborating with development partners because we didn't have any of this expertise in-house. We couldn't rely on IT to deliver this for us. It needed to be built from within inside the business because we were the ones that understood the requirement and we were the ones with access to the users that we could go out and test with. So we're on our journey. And it then allowed us to work things differently. So I've got a few slides here just I've picked out from a much longer presentation that we used for assessment just to show you the sorts of things that we needed to change. They may appear quite common sense from all the presentations I've seen today, but bearing in mind we're a government agency, quite old-fashioned in the way that we do things, and this was a real journey and learning curve for us. So I'll talk about the things that we learned. So user design was the first thing. Lots of workshops with our UX partner, lots of post-it notes, lots of Sharpie pens, trying to understand our processes, our user journeys, and so on. And then our UX partner then went off and did some interviewing with different selections of users and came back with these user pain points. Now, at this point in time, these were all things that I knew. I'd had people come up to me at briefing events. For every competition, we'd run a briefing, a bit like this, to tell companies and broadcast what the competition was about. And they could come and ask questions, and they would come up and tell me how painful the existing process was. So I wasn't really surprised by these, but that wasn't enough for GDS. We needed to be able to prove to them that our users had these problems. So this was where the user research came in and the testing and evidence really to satisfy GDS. But things, for the internal users, they're things that you would expect: manual data entry, duplication of effort, transparency and visibility of processes, that process I was explaining earlier. And then for external users, I mentioned about collaborative funding. So very common when we're running competitions is we're expecting businesses to collaborate with academics. If we don't, the academics just come in and apply to all the competitions, and Innovate UK's purpose is to fund all business organisations. So the idea is they work together collaboratively. But because they're filling in a paper-based document, we found that they were just emailing the lead, what we call the lead, the person who is responsible for putting the application in, and they wanted in the research, they wanted some sort of collaboration tool to be able to work together collaboratively online. We knew the applicants don't read the guidance, they still don't today. And then manual data entry, a duplicate from that, and also feedback. So a lot of feedback we were getting is people didn't understand why they weren't funded. And so giving them access, and very often they couldn't find their feedback. We did put it online for them, but they didn't necessarily know where it was. So we needed to provide an easy way for them to go and review the assessor comments so they could learn from those if they were going to resubmit their bid or apply into a different competition. So we went away and also put this diagram together to represent the user journeys. This was something I did after the first, I mentioned we failed the first alpha assessment, because I was trying to explain to GDS that because one of the standards is they expect a user to go into the service and complete it successfully first time. And bear in mind this was a couple of years ago when we were doing this. I wanted them to understand that we wouldn't expect a user to go into the service and complete their application all in one go, because they're filling in quite a complicated application form, typically 10 questions with finances and so on. So it's typical. We wanted them to be able to come in, create an account, start on the application, collaborate with the other organisations, get them to help with the application and so on. So there's no way they were going to do a quality application, unless they prepared it all offline first, of course, to complete it in one go. So by doing this user journey map, I could show them what the service was about and explain it. So we had our three types of user, being the applicant, the assessors those were also external users. Remember, I talked about them being sort of expert business people or academics, so we wanted them to be able to log into the service, and then obviously the Innovate UK internal users interacting at various stages through the journey, from starting at the on.gov.uk, submitting their application, having it assessed, so the red blobs in the middle, and then notifying them whether they're successful or not. And then for those successful ones, going through providing us with more details, because one of the design concepts we had was only ask people for information when you need it. Bearing in mind you might get 500 applications come in, there's no point going and asking those 500 people up front for their bank details, because only 20% of them are going to be successful. So we needed to collect more information from them further down the line. We also realised during our user research and testing that the person who submits the application isn't necessarily the one that's going to run the project. A lot of organisations have people whose sole job is to write those bids, or they're going to hand that over to a project manager, and also the finance people responsible for putting in the claims. They're going to be different people again. So we needed a process as part of the journey where we could invite more users in. So this helped map that out for us. We created personas to help us understand our user needs. I won't go through those. And then we got into the prototyping. So this was a very early version of our service. The only thing that really shows you it's gov.uk is at the top, but we were experimenting, our UX partners were experimenting with this and testing. So we started off with photos. When we went for our first assessment, our assessors the people assessing us didn't like those, of course. It didn't look very gov.uk. But they were all things that we'd picked up from our users, and we were trying to express them on our screens. This is where I started getting involved in the user testing, and I was still a little bit sceptical at this stage. So I was the product owner and the service owner, and I didn't go to the first user testing, but I went to the second day. And that's really where I turned a corner, and I realised the value of actually observing our users. So listening to applicants in another room, but watching them on a screen, tell us about their pains and what was involved in putting their application in. It was a real eye-opener, and after that I tried to go to every single user testing session because I found it fascinating, and it was so insightful in terms of learning about the different types of users. I was totally hooked on it. Moving on from user design, so this is iterating. You can see it getting slightly more gov.uk-like. This was a version on the right-hand side which was close to completing our beta, still not completely there. We did some user testing. In fact, some people from GDS came in and they couldn't work out what these triangles were, symbols there. What was that telling them to do? So we went away and did some further iteration on it. And we ended up with applications similar. Well, I don't think that was the final version, but this was the dashboard because, again, in user testing, organisations would typically be working on, or some organisations might be working on numbers of bids at the same time. Second thing was going Agile. And that was quite a difficult thing to explain to people, the different process. They were used to seeing long lists of requirements and signing them off. But we needed to move quickly, and we also needed to incorporate that user feedback. So this was a diagram one of the project team put together to show working in sprints and how we could change direction if we needed to very, very quickly. We did need to put together a roadmap because we had to sort of work out what funding we needed for the different stages, but that roadmap was forever changing, and that was a challenge, actually, keeping the project on track. Given that the changing climate, government was bringing out different types of competitions that they wanted us to run, so we were having to match that against our MVP as to what we could and couldn't accommodate. Because while we were building this, we went through the European referendum, demand picked up, and we were really struggling to run those competitions on paper at that time. So it was speed up, speed up, speed up. More things on Agile, show and tells to the business, becoming familiar with those, observing user testing. I always like this picture because that guy with his head in his hands is our lead developer. We used to bring our developers along to the user testing so they could see for themselves the impact and what users were saying about it, and it really helped. And the Mensa were really supportive of that so that we could see. But yes, this was a user not really understanding what he needed to do on the screen. Ceremonies, all standard stuff for Agile projects, but again, very alien to us. We weren't familiar with this. It's things that we needed to get into the cycle of doing, now ongoing as of still today. And you see the screen there. So a lot of our teams were based remotely, so they might come into the office in Swindon 2 or 3 days a week, but they would also be working remotely as well. So luckily we had access to Cisco WebEx equipment, so we would do stand-ups in front of TV monitors. Just to enforce that, this is the location of our multidisciplinary team. So lots of different experts, UX people, developers, front-enders and so on, based all over the place, including a development team over in The Hague. So I need to collaborate across all those different locations. And then responsive as well. It was talk of responsive from Andrew's presentation. Again, this was something in the very early days. I said, yeah, people won't be putting their applications in from a mobile. No, we don't need that, don't need that. But gov.uk were very insistent on that and adamant. And in actual fact, the mobile testing enforced the fact that people they won't necessarily write their applications on the mobile, but they'll get their email notifications, they'll invite other users into the service from that. So we needed to test it thoroughly on the responsive platform as well. And again, here, those are those tick boxes or those triangles, the user not quite working out what they were. So that was good feedback, so that we needed to iterate there as well. And we also needed to test the service end-to-end to satisfy GDS that even though they might come in and out, they were happy going through the whole service from one to the other. So we've got lots of recordings of users going through the entire end-to-end service. Digital inclusion scale. So this was a big thing for us. We didn't, so it was this term, assisted digital, and we didn't understand what it was at first. So we thought it was just accessibility. Yes, yeah, we're working with UX partners, we're fully accessible. But it was only when we were talking to other gov.uk services to really get what this was about. So we give funding to businesses, and bearing in mind I'd been running competitions for the last 3 or 4 years. In that time I'd had one application come in via post, written in green ink with lots of nice diagrams associated with it, but unfortunately that person hadn't applied into a particular competition, and because it's competitive funding we couldn't accept it. And then we'd had another user who refused to use our website, so we had to find a scribe for that person. But 2 instances in about 5 years. So we tried to tell GDS, first of all, no, we don't have any assisted digital users. They're businesses, they'll get people to help them. But that wasn't good enough for GDS. We needed to prove to them the profile of our users, but also cater, because the service needed to be available for any type of user, regardless of their digital skill. So this digital inclusion scale that they refer to goes from 1, never have or never will use digital, through to 8 and 9 being extremely competent. So we did lots of surveys, bearing in mind we went to briefing events, so we couldn't just email people to do surveys. We needed to see them face to face, so that we could, because they would say, well, how do you know you've not got any assisted digital users? So we went, like I said, we went to these briefings, did lots of paper-based surveys to collect the information, and this is the profile of users that we came up with, both assessors and applicants. And again, talking to other gov.uk services as well, the thing that we focused on was this task specific. So whilst people might be very happy using that digital environment, there might be specific tasks, particularly if they're new to them, that they're very uncomfortable with, and they needed a way of us being able to guide them and help them through that until they became familiar with it. Or we needed to make sure that the service was very, very simple and intuitive so that they didn't get stuck with those task-specific things. So we already had a help desk. I mentioned the stats earlier on. So we came up with, in fact, it was one of the UX team that came up with this idea. We came up with a brochure and called it our Assisted Innovation Funding Service, which laid out options for what a user could do if they needed help with applying in for innovation funding. So using our help desk, they could call them as the first point, and we could send out that brochure if we needed to do it. And then we would talk them through their help, and if they needed extra help, if they weren't comfortable with just being talked through, we could do a video call, a Skype or WebEx with them to actually show them what they should be clicking on and so on. And then if someone was totally uncomfortable with digital, we could set up a scribe service. But bearing in mind it was a competitive process, we couldn't just go in and write their application for them, because that would have been unfair. We would provide, we'd find a mutually agreeable location, provide some sort of temp resource who would be there to type, understand how to use the service, but not help them with what they should write in their application, so that it could then be submitted into the competition. So that was our experience of assisted digital. It went down very well with GDS, and we have actually used it a couple of times since we've been live in the last 12 months. So, in summary, what did we learn from our journey? Never assume you know all your users' needs. There's always one that comes out of the woodwork, and that's why the GDS recommendation is you carry on iterating even when you're in a live environment, and you need to have an in-house UX team to be able to do that. Ensure your business users are part of the project, so you're not just developing it on the side and then expecting them to take it and own it. Key one for us was to keep evidence of everything. So all the user testing, every decision we made, we made sure we kept a log so that we could refer back to it. But it's also useful if we're questioning why we've designed something, we could go back and look at the evidence for it. Plan ahead. We needed to plan ahead because we had to keep our internal stakeholders happy. Because whilst we had to get the funding or get approval for the funding from government, the budgets were coming from internally as well, and they wanted to know what we were spending it on. Keep the team happy, I'm sure everyone concurs with that. And then in reality, the standards, whilst we found them initially very tedious, the other side of the assessment, I totally agree with them. They're there for a good reason. We had lots of feedback from our users. Oh yeah, this is gov.uk, this is like applying for my passport. It makes sense to those users out there. So it was something that they were totally familiar with and happy with. And we totally comply with following them and recommend them to anybody. So I mentioned at the beginning, I now had a UX team. So rather than having digital as a function in IT, digital is now strongly part of our operations function. So Barry's our head of innovation funding customer, he's now the service owner. And he's got the competitions team who actually run the competitions for our stakeholders. We've got our IFS team that we're trying to get into a BAU now. So we've got our team of UXers and developers and so on in there. And then we've got customer support services alongside. So that's all integrated within operations so that we can respond very, very quickly to any issues with applications or anything that comes up. And moving forward, so this is something that we're getting into now, we're building our post-award system in the same vein, so as an extension to IFS, but also now that we've got all that data online, and this has been around for ages, I know, but we're a government department. Whilst we invest in innovation, we're not necessarily that great at using it ourselves, but we're now on that transformation journey. We've started using machine learning to help us look for duplicate applications, for eligibility, for fraud checks, searching for that there. And a key one for us is assessor allocation. So rather than doing manually allocating people, assessors to those applications, we're using various terms within AI to help us to do that. So that's ongoing at the moment. We wouldn't have been able to do that when it was still all on paper. Other things we're working on is integrating with Know Your Client solutions. Government have got a digital passport project that we're participating in, and we're also part of the grants efficiency programme where they want to have a centralised database across government for anyone applying into a grant. So that's where we are today. And I think last one was a quick video that our partners did last year. Is that going to play? Yeah. Oh.
Innovate's long-term goals are really to drive the next generation of the industrial strategy, to stimulate innovation in the UK and contribute to the gross national product.
If you're a business and you come to us, it was very difficult to understand what grant do I take from you, how do I apply to you. So the first thing we looked at was, well, how do we make it easy for businesses to come and apply for our funding?
The process has always been very manual. It's done on paper, and there are associated risks with that. We've been looking for an online solution for a while, and the Innovation Funding Service is really the solution.
So as a government agency, we're obligated to deliver digital services that are compliant to the GDS digital standard.
But the project was all around the team coming together. It's a cross-functional team with a vast array of different skills, different cultures, and it was all about bringing that team together as one unit to really deliver this.
We've introduced that way of thinking of putting people at the centre of the design process. So really working with them to introduce the GDS design framework and testing every part of the development lifecycle.
Yeah, the approach that was used was an Agile approach, which is very user-focused. So it's very much about listening to the customer and adapting the product based on feedback from the customer, which worked very well.
I think what was different about working in this kind of Agile co-located format was the speed at which we're able to see things move through the whole process. So from a really early sketch and prototype right through into code just days later.
I think the goals were quite simple. We just wanted to create an amazing product for the client. And we wanted to do that by having an amazing team that could enjoy it at the same time. Otherwise it really just won't work.
So Worth and other IT suppliers were absolutely instrumental in that knowledge transfer process. What I really like about the suppliers that we work with is that they're very accommodating. You know, they recognise that we have gaps in our knowledge, and rather waiting to be asked, we need help with something, they proactively come to us because they identify that if we're not successful in being able to run the service hasn't really been implemented.
Despite being a team full of people from lots of different locations, languages, organisations, we've had a real sense of working together as one team.
IFS has been a real success. You know, we've launched it, it's now live, it's a fantastic system, the feedback we're getting from customers is great. And after it being only live for 3 weeks, we had better conversations about real data, about how many people had really applied for an application and where they were, and that is something that simply has never, ever happened before.
That's it.